Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. I'm Nick Park. I'm taking us through a series of 5-minute messages on the transmission and translation of the Bible, seeing how God was at work throughout history, ensuring that the Word of God ended up in our hands today in a way that is reliable, and we know that God can speak to us through it directly into our lives and hearts. In a previous Take 5, we talked about Jerome, the guy studying in that monastery in Bethlehem to translate the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament into Latin. A great service for Latin speakers throughout the Roman Empire who did not speak Greek or Hebrew. It was not intended to obscure the Word of God, but to enable the Word of God to reach more people. But fast forward 900 years, and Jerome's great translation was now proving a hindrance to the spreading of the Word of God. Why? Because it had become so reverenced. It was so good. It was such a good translation and had been so powerful and so popular that people said it was the only translation that was needed, that the Word of God could now be read in Latin and shouldn't be translated into any other languages. Do you know that can still happen today? For example, even today there are churches who take the King James Version of the Bible, a great English translation, very powerful, most popular translation ever, and yet they now say, no, you've got to read it in that translation and no other. And people that can't get their heads around Elizabethan English basically don't get the Bible in a language that they can fully understand. Well, the same thing was happening with Jerome's Bible when people were insisting the Bible could only be read and heard in Latin. Now, John Wycliffe was a 14th century priest and scholar. He was a professor at Oxford University, and he realized that an English translation of the Bible was needed. And his translation, he didn't speak Hebrew, he wasn't great at Greek, so he basically used Jerome's Latin translation and translated that into English. So Tyndale's Bible was a translation of a translation. Jerome had translated from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, and Tyndale then he translated from the Latin into English. But you know, Wycliffe was motivated by a deep conviction that the end of the world was approaching, because he lived through the Black Death, the plague, bubonic plague that swept through Europe, and in Britain at that time, it killed between 30 and 40% of the population of the nation. Just imagine that. Imagine towns and cities today that in a few short years, some of them, half their inhabitants die in just a few years of this dreadful plague. It was an awful thing that had a deep effect on everybody that lived through it. And so Wycliffe was convinced it was part of the end times, and this was the end of the world. But he knew the gospel had to be preached to all nations, and he knew there were people in England, in Britain, who had not heard the gospel because they didn't have the Bible in their own language. And so he started translating the Bible into English. Now, that in itself was enough to spark controversy, but it was also enough to launch a rediscovery of biblical principles. Now, Wycliffe is today sometimes known as the morning star of the Reformation. In other words, before the actual Reformation happened, with such an emphasis on people reading the Word of God for itself, the morning star is that star in the night sky that tells you it's nearly dawn. When you see the morning star, you know dawn is coming. And that's how a lot of people view Wycliffe and his translation of the Bible into English. He ended up having a group of followers who preached the gospel. They were called the Lollards. And one of the explanations for why they were called the Lollards, which is a bit of a nonsense name, doesn't really mean anything, was that whenever they were active in ministry, they would actually be the only people who would conduct funeral services for victims of the plague, because nobody else wanted to go near them in case they caught the plague. And so they would, and as they were praying over the graves, they were la 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 la, and people called them Lollards because they could hear them mumbling these prayers over the graves. But anyway, these followers of Wycliffe began preaching that people had to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, that we should read the Word of God, and as we read the Word of God, God would speak to us. Now, Wycliffe was condemned by many church leaders as a heretic. He was condemned by a pope in a papal bull, which normally meant you were going to be burnt at the stake, and yet he survived. And the reason why he survived, historians actually say, well, it was two things. He had good connections. He knew a lot of high up people. And the other, he was just lucky. That really a lot of events that could have ended up in his death didn't. And so he ended up dying of natural causes and was buried in a grave. But 30 years later, at a church council called the Council of Constance, he was condemned as a heretic. He was excommunicated from the church, 30 years too late because he's already dead. And they actually dug his bones up from his grave and burnt them and threw the ashes into the river close by where he was buried in Lutterworth in England. John Wycliffe, a pioneer. And really, for all of us that read the Bible in English today, we have a great debt that we owe to John Wycliffe. Thank God for him and for his service for the gospel, his translation and his passion to reach people for Christ, because he thought the end was coming. Thank you for joining us today for this Take 5. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.